I know. So today we're going deep on Billy the Kid. You know, outlaw gunslinger, Wild West legend. I mean, we've got it all. We've got newspaper articles from back in the day, historical biographies, even some clips from a recent podcast. So yeah, we're going to get into all that. You might think you know the story, but trust me. After this deep dive, you'll see Billy the Kid in a whole new light.
Yeah, what's really interesting about Billy the Kid is that he's often reduced to a caricature, like the quick draw kid, almost like a symbol of lawlessness. But I think there's a lot more to his story, especially when we think about the Lincoln County War. I mean, that really shaped him.
Okay, yeah. So the Lincoln County War, I mean, most people probably have some idea about it, but can you set the scene for us? Like, what was going on back then, and how did young William Bonney, I mean, that was his name back then, how did he get mixed up in all of this?
So imagine New Mexico in the late 1870s. You're in Lincoln County, and control of the economy meant controlling everything. You had this powerful group led by this businessman named Jimmy Dolan. And they pretty much had a stranglehold on the region. They were the establishment, the law unto themselves, really. But then John Tunstall shows up. He was a rancher with a vision for a fairer system, and he starts challenging their power. That's where the trouble begins.
So that's where Billy the Kid comes in. He was working for Tunstall, right?
Exactly. Billy was still just a teenager at this point.
Hmm.
But he forms a real bond with Tunstall. It wasn't just employer and employee. There was real respect there, real loyalty. So when Tunstall is murdered in 1878, ambushed by Dolan's men, it hits Billy hard. This act of violence is what kicks off the Lincoln County War, and Billy joins the fight. Alongside the regulators, this group of Tunstall loyalists who are seeking justice.
So he wasn't just some gunslinger looking for fame. It sounds like there was something more driving him.
Definitely. The typical story paints Billy as this bloodthirsty outlaw.
Yeah.
But what we see from these sources is that he was motivated by loyalty to Tunstall and the sense of justice. He saw how corrupt Lincoln County was, how Dolan's faction used the system to their advantage, and he fought back. I mean, this was a young man, thrown into this intense situation, forced to make these life or death choices.
It makes you realize there's always more to the story, especially with guys like Billy the Kid. But like you said, the war was brutal. How did Billy handle all that violence? And how did it change him?
The Lincoln County War was a bloody affair, just a series of escalating retaliations. Billy was right in the middle of it, gunfights, seeing friends and enemies die. There's one event that really stands out. It's called the Big Killing. This 5-day siege in July of 1878. Billy and the regulators were trapped in a burning building, surrounded by Dolan's men. They managed to escape. But it must have been incredibly traumatic.
Yeah, I can imagine. To be that young, facing that kind of danger, it must have taken a toll on him. Did he ever try to get away from that violence?
He did. It's not something a lot of people know. But after the war ended, Billy reached out to Jimmy Dolan. He wanted to try to make peace.
Wow, seriously. This seems like a huge risk after everything that happened. Why would Dolan even consider that?
Seems like Billy was just tired of fighting. Maybe he hoped to stop any more bloodshed. So they worked out a deal. They agreed not to testify against each other, like an honor among thieves kind of thing. But it didn't last. Later that same day, an attorney named Houston Chapman, who was connected to Dolan, was shot and killed. No one knows for sure who did it. But suspicion fell on Billy, and he had to go back into hiding.
So much for peace. It's like fate or just bad luck kept dragging him back into conflict. He tries to make peace, and then bam, another murder happens.
Yeah, it's a real turning point. Here's this guy who fought for justice, saw all this violence, tried to find peace, and he's thrown right back into a world of fear and suspicion. And that sets the stage for what comes next, when the legend of Billy the Kid really starts to grow.
Okay, so we've got Billy, betrayed by the system, back on the run. And with this reputation, this is where the legend of Billy the Kid really takes off, right?
Yeah, exactly. And to really get how this legend was built, we got to look beyond what Billy was actually doing. We got to look at the media. I mean, this is the late 1800s. Newspapers were everything back then. They shaped how people saw things, kind of like today.
Yeah, like the Wild West version of Twitter. Everyone wants the latest news, and sometimes the facts get a little twisted to make a better story.
Exactly. There was this one paper, the Las Vegas Gazette. They were really important in shaping Billy's image. They loved to sensationalize his stories. They made him out to be this daring, almost mythical figure. And it was in their pages that the name Billy the Kid first appeared. It just added to the whole mystery of it all.
So he's this media sensation, maybe even a folk hero to some. But did Billy himself play into this, or is he just caught up in it?
That's a good question. And historians are still debating it.
Yeah.
He definitely didn't hide from being an outlaw. He knew his reputation had power, that it scared his enemies. and drew in people who admired him. People who saw him as defying authority.
This guy, barely out of his teens, he's a master of his own myth, shaping his image in a way that would last for generations. But fame is a double-edged sword, right? It can disappear. And being notorious comes with a price.
For sure. Some people saw him as this symbol of rebellion, like a Robin Hood fighting a corrupt system, but others saw him as dangerous, a real threat. I think that's key to understanding why people are still so interested in Billy the Kid. He represents the contradictions of the Wild West, this romantic ideal of freedom, clashing with the reality of violence and survival.
Yeah, and speaking of clashing realities, let's talk about Pat Garrett. Every good story needs a rival. And Garrett, the lawman who brought Billy down, he's just as interesting as Billy himself.
Oh yeah, absolutely. When Pat Garrett arrived in Fort Sumner in 1878, it was a big turning point for Billy. And what's interesting is, at first, they weren't enemies at all. They were both good card players, and they even considered each other friends.
Really? I didn't know that. They knew each other before all the conflicts. It's like a Shakespearean tragedy. So what happened? What made them enemies?
Well, in 1880, Garrett was elected sheriff of Lincoln County, and he ran on a platform of law and order, and that put him directly against Billy, who was still a fugitive. It's the classic setup. Lawman versus outlaw.
And it was quite a showdown. Pauses, close calls, that shootout at Stinking Springs. I mean, that must have been a turning point for them, from this weird respect to pure hatred.
Definitely. The Stinking Springs shootout. One of Garrett's deputies was killed. It's not clear who fired the shot, but it turned public opinion against Billy, and Garrett became even more determined to catch him.
So it was personal for Garrett, not just about the law anymore. It was revenge, proving himself. And then he writes that book, The Authentic Life of Billy the Kid, right after Billy's death.
Yeah, Garrett's book is really interesting because it tells us as much about him as it does about Billy. It's a good story, but it's full of inaccuracies and exaggerations. It paints Billy as this ruthless killer and downplays anything good about him.
The winner gets to write the history, shaping the story to his advantage. It makes you wonder how much of what we know about Billy the Kid is really just Pat Garrett's version, colored by his own biases.
It's a good lesson about storytelling and history. Garrett's account became the main source. For a lot of the biographies that came after, it shaped how Billy's story has been told.
Which brings up a good point. History is rarely objective. It's usually a battle of stories, each one claiming to be the truth. And with Billy the Kid, fact, fiction, and legend, it's all blurred together.
Right. We can't take these historical accounts at face value. We have to remember they're products of their time, influenced by the people who wrote them.
All right, so we've got this complicated guy, shrouded in myth and controversy, and the final act of his story, the confrontation with Pat Garrett that led to his death. That's the most debated part. Let's talk about those final moments, the events that cemented Billy the Kid's place in the Wild West.
Well, after Billy's escape from the Lincoln jail in April of 1881, things changed. The stakes were higher, there was a lot of pressure, and Pat Garrett, driven by duty and I think a personal vendetta, he was more determined than ever to catch Billy, dead or alive.
What about Billy? After that escape, was he looking to disappear, or was he still defiant?
Even while he was on the run, Billy was still defiant. He even sent a letter to Governor Lew Wallace, the same governor he tried to make a deal with years earlier, asking for a pardon, saying he didn't kill the deputies during his escape.
Wow, so he's still trying to clear his name, hoping for a peaceful solution, even after everything. That shows some real resilience. Like, he still thought things could turn around.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It shows how complex he was. But Governor Wallace, he was under a lot of pressure to restore order, and maybe he was still angry about the broken deal. He ignored Billy's request. He actually increased the reward for Billy's capture and even started practicing his shooting, like he was getting ready for a confrontation.
Wow, this is getting intense. You can feel the tension building, like it's all leading up to something. So where did Billy go after he escaped? Was he trying to hide, or did he go back to familiar territory?
He made a risky move. He went back to Fort Sumner. He had friends there, a sense of normalcy. But it was also Pat Garrett's territory, so it was dangerous.
It's like he couldn't resist going home, even if it meant risking his life. Weren't there rumors about a romance in Fort Sumner, too?
Yeah, with Polita Maxwell, Pete Maxwell's sister. It was a controversial relationship, but it shows Billy's charisma and how complex he was. It goes against that simple image of him as a cold-blooded killer. He was capable of love and connection, even in all the chaos.
It reminds you, he wasn't just a symbol, not just a name in a history book. He was a real person with hopes and fears and desires, trying to survive in a world that was against him. But going back to Fort Sumner, that was a fatal mistake, wasn't it?
It was. Even with the risks, Billy didn't hide. He moved around Fort Sumner pretty openly. He trusted his friends, maybe too much. People knew he was there. Rumors spread, and those rumors reached the one man who was determined to find him.
Pat Garrett. It's like their paths were destined to cross again. This final confrontation.
It was July 14th, 1881. Garrett got a tip, and he rode into Fort Sumner with two of his deputies. It was the setup for a showdown. That would become legend.
So tell us what happened that night, when these two worlds collided.
It was late, past midnight. When Garrett and his deputies got to the Maxwell Ranch, they waited outside, hidden in the darkness. You can imagine the tension. As Garrett prepared to face the man he'd been chasing for so long, this wasn't just about capturing an outlaw. It was about settling a score, restoring his own reputation, maybe even finding some kind of redemption.
And Billy. Did he know what was waiting for him? Did he sense the danger?
It seems like he didn't. Billy went into the house just before Garrett. He wasn't wearing shoes, and he didn't have a weapon. He was probably looking for food, or maybe to see Polita. But then he saw Garrett's deputies outside. He knew something was wrong.
Yeah.
And he drew his gun. It was instinct. Years of living on the edge.
He walked right into a trap, set by his former friend.
It was a moment that sealed his fate. He was confused and scared. He went into Pete Maxwell's bedroom. Garrett was standing there in the shadows. It was too dark to recognize him. Billy whispered to Maxwell in Spanish, "Who are those men outside?"
He had no idea he was talking to his enemy.
It's a tragic twist. Maxwell was startled awake. He looked at Garrett and said, "That's him." Billy finally realized the danger. He stepped back, his hand still on his gun, but it was too late.
So it didn't end with a bang, but with a whisper and a betrayal. Did Garrett even hesitate?
No. He'd been chasing Billy for years. He drew his gun and fired. The shot echoed through the night. Billy was hit in the chest and died instantly.
It's a strange ending for a life that was so intense. No epic shootout, no last stand, just a sudden and brutal end in a dark bedroom, like fate had the final say. It's a sad end to a life that still gets people talking. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Even today, Billy the Kid still fascinates people. He was gunned down in the dark, and his legend just grew from that moment. It really makes you think how much of his story is real, how much is made up, and will we ever really know the truth?
That's the question, isn't it, Billy? The kid's story is kind of like the Wild West itself. It's all mixed up with truth and legend. It's hard to separate them.
We've got all these different versions of the story, these big personalities, and it all takes place in this setting that practically begs to be turned into a myth. It's a dream for a historian, but also a real challenge.
Exactly. And after Billy died, those different stories just became even stronger. Some people called Garrett a hero, but others questioned how it all happened. They said it was an ambush, maybe even that Billy was shot in the back.
Even in death, Billy the Kid couldn't avoid controversy. But that's part of what keeps his story alive, this mystery, this back and forth between the man and the myth.
Totally. He becomes this empty canvas where we can project our own ideas about right and wrong rebellion, the appeal of the outlaw. Was he a cold-blooded killer, or was he a victim of his circumstances? A hero or a villain? We keep asking these questions because there aren't any easy answers.
It reminds us that history isn't always clear-cut. It's complicated, full of contradictions and gray areas. That's what makes it so interesting.
That's one of the main things we learned from looking at Billy the Kid's life. We can't just simplify things or label people as good or bad.
Yeah.
The reality is much more complicated, much more human.
We need to understand the context of the things happening around him, the choices people made in a system that often wasn't fair.
Right. We also need to remember that stories are shaped by the people who tell them. History is written by people, and those accounts can change how we see things. Garrett's book, even with all the stuff he made up, had a big impact on how we remember Billy the Kid.
It shows that we need to think critically about history, to look for different perspectives, and to question what we're told. So what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from this? What's the big idea, the aha moment?
I think it's this. Billy the Kid, despite being so famous, was still a person, a product of his time, shaped by things he could and couldn't control. His story isn't just about right and wrong. It makes us think about how complex the past really was, to see the uncertainty and to resist the urge to come up with easy answers in a world that rarely offers them.
Well said. And it's a story that still matters today. We're still talking about Billy the Kid over 100 years later. His picture is everywhere, from T-shirts to movies.
He's become a true icon, a symbol of the Wild West. He reminds us that we're always drawn to outlaws, rebels, people who live on the edge of society. But it's our job to see past the myth, to engage with the history, and to come to our own conclusions about who he really was.
So to our listeners, we ask you this. What do you think about Billy the Kid? Was he a hero, a villain, or somewhere in between? Take a look at the things we've talked about. Dig a little deeper and see what you find. Maybe you'll change your mind about something or see things in a new way. That's the best part about history. It's a journey, and it's yours to explore.
And who knows, maybe you'll find other interesting people and forgotten stories. The Wild West is full of them. There's always something new to discover.
Exactly. So until next time, keep asking questions, keep exploring, and keep diving deep.